Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The radio crackled to life at 6:47 a.m., cutting through the silence of Yellowstone's Lamar Valley Ranger Station like a knife through flesh. John Martinez had been nursing his second cup of coffee, reviewing geological surveys that his colleagues had dismissed as nerd shit the day before, when dispatch's voice shattered his concentration. Unit 47, we have a code yellow. Missing hiker, female, age 24, last seen on the Specimen Ridge Trail. Family called it in 20 minutes ago. John set down his mug, the ceramic clicking against the scarred wooden desk. Steam rose from the black coffee, but he barely noticed. 24 years old. Same age as his daughter Sophia would be in 2 years. Unit 47 responding, he replied, his voice steady despite the familiar knot forming in his stomach. Can you give me details on the missing person? Affirmative. Rachel Chen, Asian female, 5'4", approximately 120 pounds. Black hair, brown eyes. Last seen wearing a red North Face jacket and blue jeans. She was hiking alone yesterday afternoon. Boyfriend called us when she didn't return to their campsite at Grant Village. John's fingers found the photograph tucked into his shirt pocket. Sophia laughing at her college graduation, her dark eyes sparkling with the same intelligence that his colleagues consistently underestimated in him. He pushed the image away and focused on his equipment checklist. GPS unit, emergency radio, medical kit, rope, water purification tablets, emergency flares. Any idea why she was hiking alone? John asked, shouldering his pack. The familiar weight of 60 pounds of gear settled across his shoulders like an old friend. Boyfriend says they had an argument. She wanted space. Took off around 2 p.m. yesterday to clear her head. The autumn air hit John's face as he stepped outside, sharp and clean with the promise of winter. October in Yellowstone meant unpredictable weather, early sunsets, and temperatures that could kill an unprepared hiker. The aspens had already turned, their golden leaves creating a carpet that muffled footsteps and hid trail markers. John's radio crackled again. Unit 47, additional information. Rangers Thompson and Bradley are already on scene at the trailhead. They've been searching since dawn. Of course they were. Thompson and Bradley, the golden boys of the Ranger Service, both former military, both built like linebackers, both convinced that John's analytical approach was overthinking everything. They'd probably spent the morning trampling potential evidence and scaring off any witnesses with their loud, aggressive search methods. Copy that, John replied. ETA to trailhead is 15 minutes. He climbed into his patrol truck, a 2015 Ford F-150 with 147,000 miles and a temperamental heater. The engine turned over on the second try, and he pulled out onto Grand Loop Road, heading south toward the Specimen Ridge trailhead. The morning sun was still low, casting long shadows across the meadows where elk grazed peacefully. Too peacefully, John noticed. Usually the herds were more active this time of day, but they seemed unusually still, their heads raised and alert, as if listening to something he couldn't hear. His phone buzzed against his chest. A text from Maria, his wife. Drive safe. Sophia called last night worried about her midterms. Maybe give her a call later. John smiled despite the knot in his stomach. Sophia, studying environmental science at Colorado State, following in his footsteps despite his colleagues' subtle suggestions that she might be better suited for something less demanding. The same bullshit he'd been hearing for 15 years. The radio crackled again. All units, be advised. Weather Service is calling for a cold front moving in this afternoon. Temperature drop of 20-30 degrees expected, with possible snow at higher elevations. John's jaw tightened. Rachel had been out there for over 16 hours, possibly with minimal gear. If she was injured, if she couldn't maintain her body temperature. He pressed the accelerator harder. The Specimen Ridge trailhead parking area was a chaos of vehicles when John arrived. 2 Ranger trucks, a Park Service SUV, and a beat-up Honda Civic that probably belonged to Rachel's boyfriend. Thompson and Bradley were standing neir their truck, their voices carrying across the lot in the crisp morning air. Probably just wandered off the trail like they always do. City girl doesn't know her ass from her elbow in the wilderness. John parked and approached them, noting the way they barely acknowledged his presence. Thompson, a broad-shouldered man with a crew cut and perpetual 5 o'clock shadow, glanced at John's notebook. Jesus, Martinez, you writing a dissertation? This isn't rocket science. Girl gets lost, we find her, we bring her back. Any tracks? John asked, ignoring the jab. Bradley, Thompson's younger clone, gestured toward the trail. Some boot prints heading up, but it's hard to tell with all the leaf cover. Soil's pretty dry too. John knelt at the trailhead, examining the ground with the systematic approach that had earned him a degree in geology and the contempt of his more practical colleagues. The boot prints were there, size 7 or 8, with a distinctive tread pattern. But there was something else, a disturbance in the leaves that didn't match normal hiking patterns. She wasn't alone, John said quietly. Thompson snorted. Boyfriend already told us she was hiking solo. Look at the prints. John pointed to a subtle impression near the trail marker. 2 different tread patterns, different sizes. He pulled out his phone and took detailed photos of the prints, noting GPS coordinates and soil conditions. Thompson and Bradley exchanged the look he'd seen 1,000 times, the "there goes the nerd again" expression that made him want to prove them wrong with every fiber of his being. A young man approached from the Honda Civic. Asian, early 20s, with the kind of desperate energy that comes from a sleepless night of worry. Are you the ranger in charge? He asked John, ignoring Thompson and Bradley entirely. I'm Ranger Martinez. You must be Rachel's boyfriend. Kevin Chen. We've been together for 3 years. His voice cracked slightly. She's never done anything like this before. Rachel's careful, she plans everything. She wouldn't just disappear. John pulled out his notebook, earning another eye roll from Thompson. Tell me about yesterday, start from the beginning. Kevin's story was straightforward but troubling. He and Rachel had driven up from Bozeman for a long weekend of hiking. They'd been planning to tackle some of the more challenging trails in the park, but they'd argued about their future. He wanted to move to Seattle after graduation. She wanted to stay in Montana. She said she needed to think, needed to walk it off. That's what she always does when she's stressed, but she promised she'd be back before dark. Kevin's hands shook as he lit a cigarette. When she didn't come back to camp, I thought maybe she was still mad, maybe sleeping in the truck or something. But when morning came... Did she take any gear with her? John asked. Her day pack, water bottle, some granola bars, her phone. She was wearing her red jacket and hiking boots. John made notes, calculating. A day pack meant limited supplies. If Rachel was injured or lost, she'd been fighting exposure for over 16 hours with minimal resources. Did she know this particular trail? Kevin shook his head. We've never been here before. We usually stick to the easier trails around Bozeman. Thompson stepped forward, his impatience obvious. Look, we're burning daylight here. Bradley and I will take the main trail. Martinez can follow up with his analysis. The word dripped with disdain. We'll have her back down here in a couple hours. John watched them stride off up the trail, their heavy boots crushing potential evidence with each step. He turned back to Kevin. I know this is hard, but I need you to think. Did Rachel mention anything unusual? Any concerns about the area? Anything that seemed off? Kevin took a long drag from his cigarette. Actually, yeah. When we got here yesterday, she said something weird. Said the forest felt wrong somehow. But Rachel's always been sensitive to, I don't know, vibes or whatever. I figured she was just stressed about our fight. The word wrong echoed in John's mind as he studied the tree line. The elk were still unnaturally still in the meadow beyond, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from the shadows between the trees. John shouldered his pack and started up the trail, following the boot prints that told a story his colleagues were too impatient to read. Chapter 3. Into the Wrong. The Specimen Ridge Trail climbed steadily through mixed forest, the path switching back and forth up the mountain slope. John moved at a measured pace, stopping frequently to examine the ground, the vegetation, the subtle signs that most people missed. Rachel's boot prints were clear enough for the first half mile, size 7 New Balance trail runners, with a distinctive hexagonal tread pattern, but there were other prints too, larger boots, size 10 or 11, with a smooth sole that suggested work boots rather than hiking gear. John keyed his radio. Unit 47 to Units 23 and 31, do you copy? Thompson's voice crackled back, heavy with static. Unit 23, we're about 2 miles up. No sign of her yet. Any other hikers on the trail this morning? Negative. You finding something down there, Professor? John ignored the sarcasm. Be advised there were at least 2 people on this trail yesterday. Stay alert. The radio went dead. As John climbed higher, the forest began to change. The air grew colder, carrying scents that seemed wrong for October. The sweet, sick smell of flowers blooming out of season, mixed with something metallic that made his sinuses ache. The bird calls that had provided a natural soundtrack to his climb gradually faded to silence. At the 1 mile mark, John found the first anomaly. Rachel's boot prints continued straight up the trail, but the larger prints veered off into the underbrush, heading toward a dense stand of lodgepole pines. John followed the deviation for 50 yards, before losing the trail in thick duff. When he returned to the main path, his hands were shaking slightly. Not from cold or exertion, but from something else, a creeping sense of unease that seemed to emanate from the forest itself. His phone buzzed. A text from Sophia. Dad, I had the weirdest dream about you last night. You were lost in a forest and something was hunting you. Call me when you can. John stared at the message, his daughter's words sending a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Sophia had always been intuitive, even as a child. She'd wake up crying the night before family emergencies, get sick on days when bad news was coming. He pocketed the phone and kept climbing. The trail wound through a series of meadows connected by corridors of pine and fir. In the third meadow, John found Rachel's water bottle. It was sitting upright on a flat rock, cap screwed on tight, still half full. No signs of struggle, no scattered belongings. Just the bottle, placed with deliberate precision. John photographed the bottle from multiple angles before carefully bagging it as evidence. The placement was wrong. Hikers didn't stop for a drink and leave their water behind, especially not hikers who were lost or in distress. The radio crackled. Unit 47, this is base. We've got Rachel Chen's cell phone pinging towers. Last signal was at 4:17 p.m. yesterday. Coordinates 44.9167, 110, Waiting 33. John checked his GPS. Those coordinates were another mile up the trail near Specimen Ridge proper. Rachel had made it at least that far before her phone went dead. As he climbed toward the coordinates, John noticed more wrongness in the forest. Trees that should have been shedding their needles for winter were unnaturally green. Patches of wildflowers bloomed in defiance of the season, and everywhere, the too sweet smell of decay masked by artificial florals. At 9:47 a.m., John reached the coordinates where Rachel's phone had last transmitted. The trail here split into 3 directions, one continuing up toward Specimen Ridge, one heading east toward Amethyst Creek, and an unofficial path that disappeared into a grove of ancient Douglas firs. The official trail showed no recent sign of passage, but the unofficial path. John knelt beside the narrow track and felt his blood turn cold. Rachel's boot prints were there, clear and recent, but they weren't alone. Dozens of other prints surrounded hers. Men, women, children, all heading deeper into the grove. The prints varied in age and condition, some looking fresh, others weathered by rain and time. Some of the prints looked like they'd been made by people walking barefoot. John keyed his radio. Unit 47 to base, I need backup at coordinates 44.9167, 110.1833. Found evidence of multiple individuals, possibly a large group. Static answered him. John checked his radio. Full battery. Good signal strength according to the display. He tried again. Unit 47 to any unit, please respond. Nothing but white noise. John checked his cell phone. No signal. despite being in an area that usually had decent coverage. The screen showed a full battery, but when he tried to call dispatch, the phone simply wouldn't connect. He was alone. The unofficial trail beckoned, winding into the grove of massive Douglas firs. The trees were old growth, survivors from before the Great Fires of 1988, their trunks so wide that 3 people couldn't wrap their arms around them. Between their massive boles, the light took on a greenish quality, filtered through layers of needles that seemed to absorb sound as well as sunlight. John hesitated at the threshold of the grove. Every instinct told him to wait for backup, to stick to protocol, to be the cautious analyst his colleagues expected him to be. But Rachel's prints led into that green twilight, and with each passing hour, her chances of survival diminished. John stepped into the grove, and the forest swallowed him whole. The grove existed in its own microclimate, warmer than the surrounding forest despite the canopy that blocked most of the sunlight. John's breath no longer misted in the air, and he found himself unzipping his jacket as he followed the trail of footprints deeper into the cathedral silence of the ancient trees. The path wound between the massive trunks in a pattern that seemed almost ritualistic, spiraling inward toward some unseen center. John's geological training kicked in as he noted the unusual rock formations scattered throughout the grove. Limestone outcroppings that shouldn't exist at this elevation, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of weather into shapes that looked disturbingly organic. 20 yards into the grove, John found the first piece of clothing, a hiking sock, men's size large, hung from a low branch like a flag of surrender. The fabric was weathered, faded by seasons of exposure, but the synthetic material suggested it was relatively recent. John photographed it in place before carefully removing it with tweezers and sealing it in an evidence bag. 30 yards further, another sock. This one smaller, women's size, newer looking. The pattern continued. Socks, shoes, pieces of clothing distributed along the path like breadcrumbs leading deeper into the grove. John's radio hissed with static, and for a moment he thought he heard voices. But when he adjusted the frequency, only white noise emerged from the speaker. The trail of belongings led to a clearing in the heart of the grove. A perfect circle, perhaps 50 feet across. The ground was bare earth, packed hard by countless footsteps, surrounded by a ring of the ancient Douglas firs. At the center of the clearing stood a single lodgepole pine, younger than its giants surrounding it but still substantial, maybe 60 feet tall with a straight trunk that rose like a pillar toward a small circle of sky. And around the base of that central tree, John found them. Dozens of personal items arranged in careful patterns. Wallets, driver's licenses, jewelry, clothing, hiking gear. Some items looked fresh, others had been weathered by multiple seasons. John's trained eye cataloged what he was seeing, a collection spanning years, maybe decades. He approached the tree cautiously, his geological hammer ready in his right hand, his radio in his left, despite its apparent uselessness. The items were organized by type, electronics in one pile, jewelry in another, identification documents in a third. It was systematic, deliberate, ritualistic. John knelt beside the pile of IDs and began photographing them individually. Washington State driver's license, expired 3 years ago. Montana license, current. Wyoming, Idaho, California. A student ID from Montana State University. And there, near the bottom of the pile, Rachel Chen, DOB 08-15-1994. The photo showed her smiling, confident, alive. John's hands shook as he bagged the license. Rachel had been here in this clearing at some point after she'd started hiking. But where was she now? A sound from the tree line made him freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the clearing just beyond the sight line. John stood slowly, his hammer raised, his eyes scanning the shadows between the massive trunks. Rachel Chen, this is Park Ranger Martinez. If you can hear me, please respond. The footsteps stopped. John waited, counting his heartbeats, feeling sweat trickle down his back despite the moderate temperature. The silence stretched until his ears began to ring, and then laughter. Soft at first, barely audible, coming from multiple directions at once. Children's laughter mixed with adult voices, echoing strangely in the confined space of the clearing. The sound seemed to bounce off the limestone outcroppings, creating harmonics that made John's teeth ache. "This is Ranger Martinez," he called out, his voice stronger than he felt. "I'm here to help. No one's in trouble. I just need to know everyone's okay." The laughter grew louder, more discordant. John realized with growing horror that some of the voices sounded like they were coming from above, from the canopy itself. He tilted his head back and saw them. Figures in the branches, dozens of them, perched on limbs that should have been too thin to support human weight. Men, women, children, all wearing the remains of hiking clothes, all staring down at him with eyes that reflected what little light filtered through the canopy. John's radio suddenly burst to life with clear, strong signals. "Unit 47, this is Thompson. Where the hell are you? We've been calling for an hour." John keyed the mic with shaking fingers. "Unit 23, I'm in a grove approximately 1 mile east of Rachel Chen's last known position. I've found evidence of multiple missing persons. Request immediate backup and search and rescue coordination." "Unit 47, you're breaking up. Say again your location." John tried to respond, but the figures in the trees were moving now, flowing from branch to branch with impossible grace. Their laughter had taken on a different quality, hungry, predatory. And then he heard it. A voice he recognized calling from somewhere deeper in the grove. "Help. Please. Someone help me." Rachel. Alive, conscious, calling for rescue. John looked at the figures in the trees, at the collection of personal belongings around the central pine, at the paths leading deeper into the grove. Every rational part of his mind screamed that this was a trap, that he should retreat, wait for backup, follow protocol. But Rachel was alive and she was calling for help. John Martinez, underestimated intellectual, devoted father, and sworn protector of park visitors, made his choice. He followed her voice deeper into the grove. The trees grew denser as John moved away from the clearing, their branches interweaving overhead to create a tunnel of green twilight. Rachel's voice called to him intermittently, always from ahead, always just out of sight around the next bend in the trail. "Here. I'm here, please hurry." John's rational mind cataloged the inconsistencies. Rachel's voice was too clear, too strong for someone who'd been missing for 18 hours in difficult conditions. The acoustics of the forest made it impossible to determine exact direction or distance. And there was something wrong with the cadence, the inflection, as if someone was repeating learned phrases rather than speaking naturally. But his heart, his protective instincts, his memories of Sophia laughing in that same young woman voice drove him forward. The trail led down into a depression he hadn't noticed on any of his topographical maps. The ground here was different, softer, more organic, with a spongy quality that absorbed his footsteps completely. Strange fungi grew in rings around the bases of trees, their caps an unnatural blue-white that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. John's radio crackled again, Thompson's voice now distorted and barely intelligible. "Unit Zzt, where? Zzt, missing, coordinate, Zzt." "Thompson, I can barely hear you," John responded. "I'm following an unmapped trail in a grove east of the last GPS coordinates. Multiple missing persons, possible cult activity." Only static answered him. As John descended deeper into the depression, he began to notice the bones. They were scattered casually among the roots and fallen logs, bleached white by weather and time. John's geological training let him identify them quickly: human femurs, rib cages, skulls grinning up at him from beds of pine needles. Some looked old, weathered by years of exposure. Others seemed much more recent. The wrongness of the forest was intensifying. Trees that should have been dormant for winter pulsed with unnatural sap, their bark weeping amber tears that hardened into strange geometric patterns. The air itself felt thick, pregnant with something that made John's skin crawl and his lungs work harder to extract oxygen. Rachel's voice called again, closer now. "I can see you. You're so close. Please don't leave me." John rounded a bend and found himself in another clearing, this one smaller and more intimate than the collection point he'd discovered earlier. A natural amphitheater carved into the hillside, with limestone benches arranged in concentric circles around a depression filled with dark water. Rachel sat on the far side of the water, her red jacket bright against the gray stone. She was facing away from John, her black hair hanging loose around her shoulders, her posture suggesting exhaustion or injury. "Rachel," John called out, starting around the edge of the pool. She turned at the sound of his voice, and John's blood froze in his veins. The thing wearing Rachel's jacket and Rachel's hair had no face. Where her features should have been was a smooth expanse of pale flesh, broken only by a mouth that opened too wide and spoke in Rachel's stolen voice. "Thank you for coming," it said. "We've been so lonely." John stumbled backward, his geological hammer raised defensively as more figures emerged from the amphitheater seating. Men, women, children, all wearing the clothes of hikers and campers, all with that same smooth, featureless expanse where their faces should have been. They moved with unnatural coordination, flowing down the limestone steps like water, their borrowed voices speaking in unison. "Stay with us," they said in Rachel's voice. "Join us," they said in the voices of a dozen missing persons. "Be part of us," they said in voices John was beginning to recognize from missing person reports dating back years. John's radio burst to life one final time, Thompson's voice clear and strong. "Unit 47, we have your GPS coordinates. Backup is en route, ETA 10 minutes. Hold your position." The faceless things stopped their advance, tilting their heads as if listening to something John couldn't hear. Then they began to laugh. Not the innocent laughter from the trees, but something darker, hungrier. 10 minutes, the Rachel thing said, standing slowly. "How much can happen in 10 minutes? John turned and ran. John crashed through the forest, his careful, analytical approach abandoned in favor of pure survival instinct. Behind him, the things gave chase, their borrowed voices calling his name, pleading for him to stay, promising warmth and companionship and an end to loneliness. The trail back to the clearing seemed longer than before, the trees closing in as if trying to trap him in the grove forever. John's lungs burned as he climbed out of the depression, his legs pumping with a strength born of desperation. His radio crackled with real voices now. Thompson, Bradley dispatched search and rescue coordinators. The outside world was trying to reach him, trying to pull him back from whatever wrongness had infected this place. Unit 47, respond if able. We have teams moving to your coordinates. John keyed the mic without stopping his headlong flight. Unit 47 to all units, do not enter the grove. Repeat, do not enter the grove. Unknown hazard, multiple casualties. Unit 47, clarify. What is the nature of the hazard? John burst into the original clearing where Rachel's ID card still lay among the scattered belongings. The faceless things were still pursuing, but they seemed reluctant to enter the open space where the ancient Douglas firs formed their perfect circle. Unit 47, hazard is... John stopped, gasping for breath, trying to find words for what couldn't be explained. Hazard is unknown. Request hazmat team, psychological evaluation team, and... He paused, knowing how it would sound. Request consultation with local Native American tribal authorities. This site may have cultural significance. The pause on the radio told him everything he needed to know about how his request was being received. John circled the clearing, keeping to the edge where the ancient trees provided some psychological barrier between him and the pursuing entities. His analytical mind was reasserting itself now that he had distance from immediate danger. The grove was wrong, but it was wrong in specific ways. The geological formations, the unnatural growth patterns, the collection of personal belongings, it all suggested something that had been here for a very long time, something that predated European settlement, maybe predated human presence entirely. His phone buzzed. A text from Sophia. "Dad, I'm really worried. Please call me as soon as you can." John's heart clenched. His daughter, sensitive to things others couldn't perceive, reaching out across hundreds of miles because some part of her knew he was in danger. He was typing a response when the attack came. The faceless things burst from the tree line all around the clearing, moving with inhuman speed and coordination. John ran for the central pine tree, the only high ground in the clearing, dropping his phone and radio in his haste. He scrambled up the straight trunk, his geological hammer tucked into his belt, his hands finding purchase on the rough bark. Behind him, the entities flowed across the clearing like a tide, their stolen voices now screaming in harmony. From his perch 15 feet up the pine, John could see over the canopy to the main trail where his backup should be approaching, but the forest between him and rescue looked wrong from above. The trees swayed without wind. The paths seemed to shift and change like living things. The faceless entities gathered around the base of his tree, reaching up with arms that stretched too far, speaking in voices that cycled through every missing person whose belongings lay scattered in the clearing. And then, cutting through their cacophony, John heard it. A helicopter. The sound was faint but growing stronger, the distinctive whoop-whoop-whoop of rotor blades cutting through mountain air. Search and rescue, coming fast and low, probably following his last GPS coordinates. The entities heard it too. They stopped their reaching, their voices falling to whispers then to silence. As one, they turned their smooth, featureless faces toward the sky. John pulled his emergency flare from his belt and triggered it. The brilliant red light burst through the canopy, a beacon visible for miles, accompanied by the acrid smell of burning phosphorus. The helicopter sound grew louder, and John could see it now through gaps in the canopy. A Park Service rescue bird flying low and fast. The faceless things began to retreat toward the tree line, their forms becoming translucent, insubstantial. But as they faded, John heard one last voice, clear, strong, and absolutely human. "Help me," Rachel called from somewhere deeper in the grove. "Please, I'm still alive, don't leave me." The real Rachel, still out there, still calling for rescue. John looked at the approaching helicopter, at his escape route, at the promise of safety and rational explanation, and returned to his normal life. Then he looked toward the deeper grove where a young woman who reminded him of his daughter was still fighting for survival. Ranger John Martinez, intellectual, analyst, devoted father, made his second choice of the day. He climbed down from the tree and followed Rachel's voice back into the wrongness. John found Rachel in a limestone cave hidden behind a curtain of water that fell from an underground spring. The cave wasn't on any geological survey he'd studied, existing in a pocket of karst topography that shouldn't have been possible at this elevation. Rachel was alive but in bad shape. Dehydrated, hypothermic, her left ankle swollen and probably fractured. She'd fashioned a crude splint from hiking poles and was conscious but barely coherent. "You came back," she whispered as John knelt beside her. "I heard the helicopter, thought you'd leave." "I'm not leaving without you," John said, wrapping her in his emergency blanket and breaking out his medical kit. "What happened? How did you get here?" Rachel's story came out in fragments between sips of water and bites of energy bar. She'd been hiking alone, trying to clear her head after the fight with Kevin. She'd followed what looked like an official trail marker into the grove, following other hikers who seemed friendly and welcoming. "They were so nice at first," she said. "Families with kids, other young people like me. They said there was a beautiful waterfall back here, a secret spot that wasn't on the tourist maps." But as they'd gone deeper into the grove, the other hikers had begun to change. Their faces became indistinct. Their voices echoed strangely. Their movements took on an unnatural flow. "I realized something was wrong when I tried to turn back," Rachel said. "The trail was gone, like it had never existed. And the people, they weren't people anymore." She'd managed to escape during what she described as a feeding frenzy, the entities becoming so focused on some other victim that they forgot about her temporarily. She'd hidden in the cave, surviving on water from the spring and the few energy bars in her day pack. "How long have you been here?" John asked, checking her ankle and preparing a more substantial splint. 3 days? 4? I lost track. Time feels wrong in here." John checked his watch. According to the official timeline, Rachel had been missing for less than 24 hours, but his own experience in the grove suggested that temporal distortion was just one of many impossibilities they were dealing with. "Can you walk?" he asked. "I think so, with help." John fashioned a walking stick from a piece of limestone that had broken away from the cave wall, then helped Rachel to her feet. She was shaky but determined, the kind of inner strength that reminded him powerfully of Sophia. As they prepared to leave the cave, John's radio crackled to life. "Unit 47, this is Incident Commander Williams. We have your location via emergency flare. Rescue team is inbound to your coordinates." John keyed the mic. "Unit 47 to Incident Command. I have Rachel Chen, alive and responsive but requiring medical attention. Be advised, there are serious hazards in this area. Recommend establishing perimeter at main trail coordinates and winching us out rather than sending ground teams." "Copy that, Unit 47. Medical team standing by." As they made their way out of the cave, Rachel leaning heavily on John's arm, she asked the question he'd been dreading. What were those things? The ones wearing people's faces? John thought about his scientific training, his rational worldview, his reputation as the analytical ranger who could explain everything in geological or meteorological terms. "I don't know," he admitted. "Something old. Something that's been here longer than we have." "Will they come after us?" John looked back toward the deeper parts of the grove, where shadows moved independently of their sources and voices called from empty air. "I think they're tied to this place," he said. "I think as long as we keep moving toward the light, toward the outside world, we'll be okay." The helicopter found them as they reached the edge of the grove, Rachel's arm around John's shoulders, both of them limping but moving steadily toward safety. The rescue basket descended through a gap in the canopy, operated by paramedics who treated their condition as straightforward wilderness rescue rather than escape from something that shouldn't exist. As they were lifted above the trees, John looked down at the grove one last time. From above, it looked perfectly normal, just another stand of old-growth forest in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. But he knew he'd be back. There were too many missing persons, too many belongings in that clearing, too many families who deserved answers. And somewhere in the rational part of his mind, the geological part that understood deep time and the layers of history written in stone, he was already forming theories about what they'd encountered. Some things were older than human presence in North America. Some things had learned to mimic human behavior through centuries of observation, and some places were thin spots where the normal rules didn't apply. John Martinez, intellectual, scientist, survivor, had work to do. 6 months later, John sat in the Yellowstone National Park administrative offices, reviewing the final incident report on the Rachel Chen case. The official version was clean, rational, satisfying to bureaucrats and insurance companies. Missing hiker, located in unmapped limestone cave system east of Specimen Ridge Trail. Subject suffered dehydration and minor injuries but recovered fully. Ranger Martinez commended for thorough search procedures and successful rescue operation. Cave system flagged for geological survey and potential inclusion in park trail system. What the report didn't mention was the subsequent investigation John had conducted during his off hours. The patterns he'd identified in missing person reports dating back to the 1920s. The folklore he'd collected from local Native American tribes about a hungry place in the mountains, where the spirits of the lost were trapped and made to serve. The report didn't mention the follow-up visits John made to the grove, always during daylight hours, always with full backup and communication protocols. How the collection of personal belongings grew smaller each time, as if the entities were learning caution. How the limestone formations seemed to shift slightly between visits, creating new passages and closing old ones. And the report certainly didn't mention the dreams. John's phone buzzed. A text from Sophia, now graduated and working for the U.S. Geological Survey in Colorado. "Dad, I'm putting together a research proposal on anomalous geological formations in national parks. Want to be my co-principal investigator?" John smiled and typed back, "Only if you promise to stay out of any caves we can't explain." "Deal. But I'm bringing backup flares." John laughed and filed away the incident report. Outside his office window, Tourists walked the boardwalks around Old Faithful. Families on vacation. Young couples taking selfies. Hikers planning their next adventure into the wilderness. Most of them would have wonderful, safe experiences in one of America's most beautiful natural spaces. Some of them would wander off established trails, drawn by unofficial path markers and friendly voices calling from deep in the forest. And John Martinez, guardian of the wild places, keeper of uncomfortable truths, devoted father and relentless scientist, would be there to bring them home. Even when home seemed very far away. If this story gave you chills, what would you have done in John's situation? Would you have followed Rachel's voice into the grove or waited for backup? Comment below. Holy hell, that ending. Did that finale blow your mind? Like, if you want more terrifying forest ranger stories, follow for daily supernatural horror. And comment with your theory about what those faceless entities really were. I read every single one. The static from Anthony's radio cut through the morning silence of Cascade National Forest like a serrated knife. Ranger Martinez, we've got a code yellow. Missing hiker, female, age 19. Hannah Peterson, last seen on the Whispering Pines Trail yesterday evening around 1800 hours. Anthony Davis adjusted his grip on his coffee thermos, steam rising in the crisp October air. 23 years as a forest ranger, and he'd heard this call more times than he cared to count. Young hikers thinking they could conquer the wilderness with nothing but Instagram confidence and a smartphone GPS. Copy that, dispatch. What's our timeline? Anthony's voice carried the practiced calm of someone who'd pulled dozens of lost souls from these woods. Families frantic. Parents drove up from Portland overnight. They're saying Hannah knows these trails like the back of her hand. Been coming here since she was 12. Anthony frowned, clipping the radio back to his tactical vest. The experienced ones were always the most dangerous cases. Overconfidence killed more hikers than inexperience ever did. The morning air bit at his weathered face as he shouldered his 65-pound search pack. Every piece of gear had its place. Emergency beacon, first aid kit, rappelling rope, water purification tablets. Real equipment that solved real problems. Not like the ghost stories the old-timers used to spin around the ranger station. His boots crunched through the carpet of fallen maple leaves as he made his way toward the Whispering Pines trailhead. The forest felt different this morning. Heavier somehow. Probably just the low-hanging clouds pressing down from the gray October sky. Hannah Peterson, he muttered, pulling up her description on his phone. Blonde, 5'6", wearing a red North Face jacket. Should be easy to spot against the autumn foliage. Just another college kid who bit off more than she could chew. The trail stretched ahead, winding between massive Douglas firs that had been standing since before his grandfather was born. Anthony had walked these paths thousands of times. Every root, every rock, every blind curve was mapped in his muscle memory. There was nothing in these woods that couldn't be explained by simple cause and effect. His radio crackled again. Martinez, this is base. Hannah's parents are here. They want to talk to whoever's leading the search. Put 'em through. A woman's voice, raw with tears and sleepless worry. Officer, please. Hannah called me at 6 yesterday. She said something was wrong, that she could hear voices, children's voices, but there weren't supposed to be any other hikers on that trail. Anthony's jaw tightened. Panic played tricks on the mind, made people hear things, see things. Ma'am, sound carries strange in the forest. Could have been anything. Wind through the trees, bird calls, even her own echo. She's not some scared little girl. The father's voice cut in, sharp with frustration. Hannah's got her wilderness certification. She knows these mountains better than most of your rangers. Sir, I understand your concern, but... She said the voices were singing, old hymns, like children in a church choir. The line went quiet except for the mother's muffled sobbing. Anthony felt that familiar twist in his gut, the one that came when families started grasping at supernatural straws instead of facing hard realities. I'll find your daughter, he said simply. Martinez out. 3 hours into the search, Anthony had covered nearly 4 miles of the main trail and 2 side paths. Hannah's footprints were clear enough in the soft earth. Size 8 hiking boots with a distinctive waffle pattern. She'd been moving steadily northeast, staying on the marked trail until the track stopped. Not faded, not obscured by other hikers. Simply gone, as if Hannah had vanished mid-step. Anthony knelt beside the last clear print, running his finger along the boot's impression in the damp soil. The track was deep, suggesting she'd been moving quickly, maybe even running. But where the hell had she gone? He examined every inch of ground in a 20-foot radius. No signs of struggle, no disturbed vegetation, no indication she'd left the trail. It was as if she'd just dissolved. Bullshit, he muttered, standing and brushing dirt from his knees. Nobody just disappears. A cold breeze moved through the trees, carrying something that made Anthony pause. For just a moment he could swear he heard singing. High, thin voices carried on the wind. He shook his head. Altitude was playing tricks on his inner ear. Had to be. His radio buzzed. Any sign of her, Martinez? Tracking her northeast on Whispering Pines. She was moving fast before I lost the trail. I'm going to check the old settlement ruins. Hikers sometimes get turned around up there. Copy. Be advised, we've got a weather system moving in. Temperature's going to drop 15 degrees by nightfall. Anthony looked up at the darkening sky. Hannah had been out here for almost 18 hours. If she was hurt, hypothermic. He picked up his pace, following a barely visible deer path that wound toward the ruins of Millbrook Settlement. The old logging town had been abandoned since the 1920s, when the mill fire killed 37 people, mostly families with young children. Not that he believed the bullshit stories about the place being haunted. If this story's giving you chills, press the follow button for more supernatural horror. What would you do in Anthony's situation? Comment below. The ruins appeared through the trees like broken teeth in a skull's jaw. Stone foundations and charred timber beams were all that remained of what had once been a thriving community. Anthony had been here dozens of times, usually to extract teenagers who'd come looking for ghosts, and found only poison ivy and rusty nails. But something felt different today. The silence was too complete. No bird calls, no insect buzz, even the ever-present whisper of wind through the pines had died away. It was like walking into a soundproofed room. Anthony's footsteps seemed unnaturally loud as he moved through the settlement remains, calling Hannah's name. His voice echoed strangely, bouncing off the broken walls with a hollow quality that raised goosebumps along his arms. Hannah, can you hear me? In the distance, something answered. Not Hannah's voice, something higher, younger. A child's voice singing words he couldn't quite make out. Then another voice joined it, and another, until the air filled with the sound of children's choir. Anthony's rational mind kicked in immediately. Sound distortion. Echo effects off the stone ruins. Maybe hikers with kids on the parallel trail, voices carrying through the valley. But his body wasn't buying the explanation. His heart rate spiked, sweat beaded on his forehead despite the October chill, and every instinct screamed at him to get the hell out of there. Just acoustics, he said aloud, needing to hear his own voice cut through the supernatural chorus. Just fucking acoustics. He pulled out his phone to check for signal, hoping to call in his position. The screen flickered, displaying impossible readings, the time jumping between 2:47 p.m. and 6:23 p.m., the GPS coordinates shifting randomly, the battery percentage fluctuating from 78% to 23% and back again. What the hell? The singing stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, Anthony heard something that made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. Footsteps, small ones, like children running, coming from the direction of the old church foundation. Every logical fiber of his being told him to radio for backup, to wait for additional personnel, to approach this situation with proper protocol. But Hannah might be hurt, might be calling for help, and those could be other hikers' kids echoing through the ruins. He drew his flashlight and moved toward the church foundation, his breath visible in puffs of vapor. When had it gotten so cold? The stone foundation formed a perfect rectangle about 30 by 60 feet, with gaps where the doors and windows had once been. Scorched timbers lay scattered within like the ribs of some massive dead animal. At the far end, where the altar would have stood, someone had arranged stones into a rough circle, and in the center of that circle, red fabric fluttered in a breeze Anthony couldn't feel. Hannah's jacket. "Hannah!" He scrambled over the foundation wall, his boots slipping on loose stones. "Hannah, are you here?" He reached the stone circle and knelt to examine the jacket. It was definitely hers. North Face logo, right size, even smelled like the vanilla perfume his own daughter used to wear. But there was something else, something that made his trained search and rescue instincts scream warnings. No body heat residue in the fabric, no scent of human sweat or fear. The jacket was ice cold, as if it had been lying here for days instead of hours, and arranged so carefully in the center of those stones, like an offering on an altar. "This is fucked," Anthony whispered, standing up quickly. "This is so fucked." His radio crackled with static, then cleared enough for him to make out dispatch. Martinez. Weather. Moving. Fast. Need. Extraction. Dispatch. This is Martinez. I've found evidence at the Millbrook ruins. I need backup and... The radio died completely, not even static remaining. The temperature had plummeted. Anthony could see his breath now, thick clouds of vapor that hung in the air longer than they should have. Frost was forming on the stones around him, creeping across the surfaces like living ice. And through the growing cold, he heard them again. Children's voices, but clearer now. Close enough to make out words. "Come and play with us. We've been waiting so long. She's with us now. She's safe with us." Anthony's scientific mind tried desperately to rationalize what he was hearing. Thermal inversions could create acoustic mirages. Cold air could carry sounds from miles away, distort voices beyond recognition. But the voices seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding him like invisible children playing Ring Around the Rosie. His hands shook as he stuffed Hannah's jacket into his pack. Whatever was happening here, he needed to get back to base, organize a proper search team, approach this situation with backup and proper equipment. He climbed out of the foundation and started back toward the main trail, moving faster than he'd intended. The singing followed him, always just at the edge of hearing, children's voices weaving in and out of the wind that had suddenly returned with Arctic fury. Behind him, in the ruins of Millbrook Settlement, something moved. Anthony didn't look back. 23 years of experience had taught him when to push forward and when to retreat. This was definitely retreat time. But as he reached the edge of the settlement, his peripheral vision caught something that stopped him cold. A small figure standing between the trees. Child-sized, but wrong somehow. The proportions didn't match. The movements too fluid, too... old. Anthony turned to face it directly and saw nothing but shadows between the pines. Stress hallucination, he told himself firmly. Extended search protocol, fatigue, altitude, textbook psychological response. But his voice sounded hollow, even to his own ears. The hike back to the main trail felt like walking through a fever dream. The temperature continued dropping, frost forming on his beard, his breath coming in harsh puffs that burned his lungs. His GPS was still malfunctioning, coordinates spinning wildly, but his internal compass and trail knowledge kept him moving in the right direction. At least he hoped it was the right direction. The familiar landmarks looked different now, older somehow, as if the forest was aging around him with each step. Trees that should have been healthy showed signs of disease and decay. Rock formations seemed more weathered, more broken than they'd been that morning, and always at the very edge of perception he could hear them singing. When he finally reached his truck at the trailhead, Anthony's hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. The heater took forever to warm up, but when it did, the rush of hot air felt like a benediction. His phone had 3 bars of signal. He dialed dispatch immediately. "Martinez here. I need to speak with Ranger Collins immediately." "Collins isn't available. This is Sergeant Walsh. What's your status?" Anthony hesitated. How do you report ghostly children and impossible cold snaps and missing persons who leave behind their clothes arranged like ritual offerings? I found evidence of the missing hiker at Millbrook Settlement. Hannah Peterson's jacket, but no sign of Hannah herself. I need a full search team up there ASAP. Copy that. We'll have a team mobilized within the hour. Did you find any indication of what happened to her? Through the truck window, Anthony watched the forest edge where the Whispering Pines trail disappeared into shadows. For just a moment, he could swear he saw small figures moving between the trees, watching him with eyes that reflected light like animals. But when he blinked, there was nothing there. No, he said into the phone. No indication at all. The lie tasted like copper in his mouth. That night, Anthony sat in his living room nursing a whiskey and staring at Hannah's jacket, which he'd laid out on his coffee table like evidence in a court case. The fabric was still cold to the touch, still carried that strange absence of human scent. His wife Sarah found him there at 2 a.m. "Aunt, you okay, honey?" He looked up at her, this woman who'd shared his bed for 15 years, who'd raised their 2 kids while he spent long days in the wilderness pulling other people's children to safety. How could he explain that something in those woods had challenged everything he thought he knew about reality? "Just a tough case," he said finally. "Missing girl, 19 years old." Sarah sat beside him, her hand warm on his shoulder. "You'll find her. You always do." But as Anthony stared at Hannah's jacket in the lamplight, he wasn't sure he wanted to find her. Not if it meant going back to those ruins, back to that singing that still echoed in his ears hours later. Because deep down, in a place that his rational mind refused to acknowledge, Anthony Davis was starting to suspect that Hannah Peterson wasn't just missing. She was taken, and whatever had taken her was still out there in the woods singing lullabies to children who had been dead for almost a century. Holy hell, that was intense. Did this ending blow your mind? Like if you want more terrifying forest ranger stories, follow for daily supernatural horror. And comment your theory about what really happened to Hannah. I read every single one. The emergency radio crackled to life at 6:47 a.m., cutting through the pre-dawn silence of the ranger station like a serrated blade through bone. John Matthews felt his stomach drop before the dispatcher even spoke, that familiar cold crawl up his spine that had saved his life more times than he could count in his 15 years as a forest ranger. "All units, we have a missing person report. 23-year-old female Nicole Brennan failed to return from overnight camping on the Cataract Falls Trail. Last seen yesterday at 4 p.m. by fellow hikers near mile marker 7. John's weathered hands tightened around his coffee mug, the ceramic warm against his palm while an inexplicable chill settled into his bones. Something was wrong. Not just missing hiker wrong, something deeper, darker, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Unit 12 responding, he radioed back, his voice steady despite the unease coiling in his gut. The sensation wasn't new. John had learned to trust these feelings after years of unexplained hunches that led him to lost children and injured climbers. But this felt different. This felt hungry. His iPhone buzzed against the wooden desk. A text from Sarah. "Coffee's ready when you get home. Emma drew you another ranger badge. Love you." The simple message should have warmed him, but instead it intensified the dread pooling in his stomach. He'd made a promise to Emma last night. "Daddy will always come home, sweetheart. Always." John strapped on his duty belt. The familiar weight of his Maglite multi-tool and first aid kit a small comfort. His Motorola radio hissed with static as he adjusted the frequency, and his Garmin GPS unit showed full satellite connection, all the technology that should make this routine. But the cold sensation crawling up his neck whispered that nothing about this search would be routine. The morning air bit at his exposed skin as he stepped outside the station, his breath forming small clouds in the 40-degree temperature. The Smoky Mountains stretched before him in the pre-dawn darkness, their ancient peaks shrouded in the mist that gave them their name. Somewhere in that vast wilderness, Nicole Brennan was either hurt, lost, or worse. John's intuition screamed it was worse. His boots crunched on frost-covered gravel as he approached his Ford Ranger, the engine turning over with a reliable rumble. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the winding mountain road that would take him to Cataract Falls Trail. As he drove, John tried to shake the feeling that invisible eyes were watching from the tree line, but the sensation only grew stronger. The radio crackled again. Unit 12, be advised, this is the third disappearance in this area in 18 months. Previous searches came up empty. John's knuckles went white on the steering wheel. 3 disappearances. The same area. And that crawling sensation in his spine was now a full-blown alarm bell clanging in his skull. Copy that, dispatch. Any connection between the previous cases? All young women, solo campers. Rangers Myers and Thompson handled the searches. Both reported unusual circumstances. The word unusual hung in the static-filled air like a loaded gun. John knew Rangers Myers and Thompson, 20-year veterans who'd seen everything the mountains could throw at a human being. For them to report unusual circumstances meant something had rattled them to their core. As John pulled into the trail parking area, his headlights swept across Nicole's Honda Civic, the Tennessee license plate clearly visible. The car was undisturbed, windows intact, doors locked. But something made John's skin crawl as he approached. The vehicle felt wrong, like it was sitting in a pocket of space where the natural laws bent just slightly out of true. He pressed his palm against the hood. Stone cold, meaning it had been here all night. His flashlight beam revealed nothing obviously amiss, but that inexplicable wrongness seemed to emanate from the very ground around the car. The hair on John's arms stood up beneath his Ranger jacket, and he found himself glancing repeatedly at the dark tree line, where shadows seemed to shift and move independently of the wind. Unit 12 to dispatch. I'm at the victim's vehicle. Beginning trail search now. Copy, Unit 12. Backup units ETA 30 minutes. 30 minutes felt like an eternity as John shouldered his search pack and started up the Cataract Falls Trail. His LED headlamp illuminated the familiar path. But even these woods he'd patrolled for over a decade felt different this morning. The usual symphony of forest sounds, rustling leaves, distant bird calls, the whisper of wind through pine needles, was muted, as if the mountain itself was listening. 2 miles in, John found the first sign, a torn piece of bright blue fabric caught on a blackberry bramble. Nicole's camping gear manifest had listed a blue jacket. His radio crackled. Dispatch, I've got fabric evidence at mile marker 2, continuing north. But as he photographed the evidence with his phone, John felt it again, that sensation of being watched. Not by animals or other humans, but by something that existed in the spaces between perception and reality. The fabric felt ice cold despite the rising sun, and when he looked closer, the edges appeared to be burned rather than torn. If this story is giving you chills, hit that follow button for more supernatural horror. What would you do in John's situation? Comment below. 3 miles up the trail, John's GPS began acting erratically. The screen flickered between coordinates, sometimes showing his location as 50 feet underground, other times placing him in areas that didn't exist on any topographical map. His radio deteriorated to pure static, leaving him effectively cut off from backup and dispatch. The wrongness in his gut intensified with each step. The temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees since he'd started hiking, and his breath now came in thick puffs despite the morning sun filtering through the canopy. The very air seemed thick, pressing against him with an almost physical weight that made each breath an effort. At mile marker 4, John found Nicole's campsite. Her blue dome tent stood perfectly intact, guy lines taut and stakes secure, but the tent was positioned in a small clearing that John could have sworn wasn't there during his last patrol 2 weeks ago. The ground around the campsite was barren, not just cleared of vegetation, but scorched black in a perfect circle 20 feet in diameter. No campfire could have created such a pattern. Jesus Christ, John whispered, his voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. Inside the tent, Nicole's sleeping bag lay neatly arranged, her backpack organized with military precision. Her headlamp sat on a stuff sack, batteries still good. Her hiking boots were lined up at the tent's entrance as if she'd simply vanished while sleeping. But the tent walls were covered in what looked like condensation, except the droplets were ice cold and left his fingertips numb when he touched them. John's radio suddenly burst to life with a voice that wasn't dispatch. A woman's voice, desperate and terrified, crackling through heavy static. "Please, someone help me. I can't find the trail. They won't let me leave." The transmission cut to silence. John's hands trembled as he keyed the radio. "Nicole? Nicole, is that you? What's your location?" Nothing but static answered him. Then he heard it. Footsteps crunching through dead leaves coming from the north. John drew his flashlight and moved toward the sound, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But the image of his daughter Emma's trusting face, her small voice saying, "Daddy always comes home," pushed him forward. "Nicole, it's Ranger Matthews. Can you hear me?" The footsteps stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, John could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears and the rasping of his breath. Then, from directly behind him, came a voice that made his blood turn to ice. "She's with us now." John spun around, his flashlight beam sweeping across empty forest. But in that brief moment of turning, he could have sworn he saw a figure standing at the edge of his vision. Pale, translucent, with hollow eye sockets that seemed to drink in light rather than reflect it. His phone buzzed with an incoming text. With shaking hands, John looked at the screen. Unknown number. The circle at Deadman's Drop. "Come alone. Come now, or she joins us forever." John's blood went cold. Deadman's Drop. A cliff face 2 miles north where a family of settlers had fallen to their deaths in 1847. Local Appalachian legends claimed their spirits still walked the mountain, collecting the souls of the lost to ease their eternal loneliness. John had always dismissed such stories as tourist nonsense, but the text message felt like ice water in his veins. Another text arrived. "Tell your wife Sarah and daughter Emma goodbye. You won't be coming home." John's phone displayed no signal bars, yet somehow these messages were coming through. With his radio dead and his GPS malfunctioning, he was truly alone with whatever haunted these mountains. The temperature continued to drop, and frost was now forming on the metal of his equipment despite the morning sun. But Sarah's text from this morning echoed in his mind. "Emma drew you another ranger badge." His 8-year-old daughter believed her father was a hero who always came home. That faith, that pure love, was stronger than whatever supernatural force was trying to claim him. John shouldered his pack and started north toward Deadman's Drop. With each step, the forest grew more oppressive, more wrong. Shadows moved independently of their sources, and whispered voices seemed to call his name from just beyond hearing. But Emma's face in his mind burned brighter than any fear. The trail to Deadman's Drop was supposed to be clearly marked, but John found himself following a path that definitely hadn't existed during his last patrol. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to block out most of the sunlight. The air grew so cold that his breath came in thick clouds, and ice crystals began forming on his jacket. Half a mile from the drop, John saw them, figures standing between the trees, translucent and shimmering like heat mirages in reverse. Men, women, children, all with that same hollow-eyed stare that seemed to reach into his soul and squeeze. They stood silent and motionless, but John could feel their attention focused on him with laser intensity. The spirits of Deadman's Drop. The collected souls of everyone who had died on this mountain over the past century and a half. At the center of the group stood a woman in hiking gear, her blonde hair matted with what looked like dried blood. Nicole. But her eyes held that same hollow emptiness, and when she smiled at John, her lips didn't move quite right with the words that came out. "Welcome, Ranger Matthews. We've been waiting for you." John's hand moved instinctively to his radio, but he knew it was useless. The spirits formed a loose circle around him, cutting off any escape route. The temperature had dropped so far that his breath came in thick clouds and frost was forming on his eyebrows. But then John felt something else, a warmth in his chest where he kept the photo of Emma in his shirt pocket. The picture she'd drawn of him in his ranger uniform, the one where she'd written "My Hero Daddy" in purple crayon. That warmth spread through his body, pushing back the supernatural cold. "Let her go," John said, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his throat. "Take me instead." The spirit wearing Nicole's face tilted its head with predatory interest. Brave. But we don't trade, Ranger. We collect. And you both have such strong life forces, enough to sustain us for decades. John pulled out his phone, showing Emma's smiling face on his lock screen. I made a promise to my daughter. I always come home. Always. The spirits recoiled slightly from the image, and John felt that warmth in his chest grow stronger. Love, pure, unconditional love, was something these hollow entities couldn't understand or corrupt. Your love won't save you here, the Nicole spirit hissed, but John heard uncertainty in its voice. Maybe not, John replied, taking a step forward. But it'll damn sure save her. John pulled out his emergency flare gun, part of his standard search and rescue kit. The spirits laughed, a sound like wind through dead leaves. Fire can't hurt us, fool. This isn't for you, John said, pointing the flare at the dry undergrowth. It's for them. He pulled the trigger. The red phosphorus flare ignited the dead leaves and dry brush instantly. But this wasn't just any fire. It was a fire lit by a father's desperate love, fed by his unbreakable promise to come home to his daughter. The flames burned with an intensity that made the spirits scream and recoil. In the chaos, John saw the real Nicole collapse to the ground 20 feet away, alive but unconscious. The spirit that had been wearing her form shrieked as the flames spread, and John could see the translucent figures beginning to fade. But they weren't giving up. The lead spirit, a tall man in pioneer clothing with a rope burn around his neck, stepped forward through the flames. If we can't have you both, we'll take the mountain itself. Every hiker, every camper, every ranger who sets foot on this trail will join us. John felt the truth of that threat in his bones. These spirits weren't just collecting individuals. They were trying to claim the entire mountain as their domain. Emma would never be safe here. No child would. But then John remembered something his grandfather had told him about these mountains, about the old Cherokee beliefs that sacred ground could only be reclaimed by blood and sacrifice freely given. John looked at the photo of Emma one more time, kissed it, and made his choice. He stepped directly into the supernatural flames. The spirit's screams intensified as John's life force, offered freely, powered by love rather than fear, fed the cleansing fire. The flames burned away the darkness that had infected this part of the mountain, and one by one, the hollow-eyed figures began to dissolve into motes of light that drifted upward toward the sky. But John didn't burn. The fire that consumed the spirits wrapped around him like warm sunlight, and he felt his grandfather's presence, along with generations of Cherokee ancestors who had protected these mountains long before the first European settlers arrived. When the flames died, John found himself kneeling in a circle of clean, fertile earth. Nicole was breathing steadily nearby, and his radio crackled back to life. Unit 12, please respond. We have your location. John keyed the radio with shaking hands. This is Unit 12, I have the missing person. She's alive and needs medical attention. Send the paramedics to Dead Man's Drop. Copy that, Unit 12. Outstanding work. As John carried Nicole down the mountain toward the arriving search team, his phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Emma's making pancakes for when you get home. She says heroes need good breakfast. Love you. John smiled and texted back, tell her daddy's coming home, always. But as he walked, John couldn't shake the feeling that while this particular threat was ended, the mountains still held secrets. And his intuitive gift, that sixth sense that had saved Nicole and cleansed Dead Man's Drop, was stronger than ever. The Smoky Mountains had always been mysterious. Now John knew they were also protected, and he would be their guardian, ensuring that no family would lose a loved one to the darkness that lingered in the spaces between reality and nightmare. The end. Holy shit, that was intense. Did that ending blow your mind? Like, if you want more terrifying forest ranger stories, follow for daily supernatural horror. And comment your theory about what really happened to those spirits at Dead Man's Drop. I read every single one. The radio crackled to life at 6:47 a.m., cutting through Robert Rob Mitchell's morning coffee ritual like a serrated blade through silence. He'd been a forest ranger for 12 years, and emergency calls before sunrise never brought good news. The voice on the other end belonged to Sarah Chen, the park dispatcher, her usually calm demeanor cracked with barely contained panic. "Rob, we've got a missing hiker. 23-year-old female, Stephanie Morris, last seen yesterday evening on the Devil's Backbone Trail near the old Covenant Church ruins." Rob nearly choked on his coffee. The Devil's Backbone Trail. Of course it had to be there. Every superstitious local avoided that section of forest like it carried the plague, spinning tales about cursed ground and unholy happenings. Complete horseshit in Rob's scientific opinion, but the area did have an unusually high number of accidents and disappearances over the decades. "Family called it in about 20 minutes ago," Sarah continued, her voice wavering slightly. "She was supposed to check in last night, never came home. Rob, her parents they're driving up from Portland right now. They're scared out of their minds." Rob crushed his empty coffee cup, the aluminum crinkling like brittle bones. He'd never lost a hiker on his watch, and he wasn't about to start now. "I'm heading out. Send me her photo and last known coordinates." 20 minutes later, Rob's Forest Service truck rumbled down the gravel access road toward the Devil's Backbone trailhead. His equipment belt hung heavy with essentials: Motorola two-way radio, Garmin GPS unit, first aid kit, emergency flares, and his grandfather's compass, the only sentimental item he carried. The morning fog clung to the Douglas firs like ghostly fingers, reducing visibility to maybe 30 yards. His phone buzzed with Stephanie's photo. Pretty brunette with kind eyes and a gap-toothed smile, wearing a bright red hiking jacket. The kind of girl who probably fed stray cats and volunteered at animal shelters. The kind who didn't deserve to spend a night alone in these unforgiving woods. The trailhead parking area was nearly empty except for a lone Honda Civic with Oregon plates, Stephanie's car. Rob approached it methodically, noting details with practiced eyes. No signs of struggle. Doors locked. Registration visible through the windshield matched the missing person report. Her hiking boots were gone, replaced by flip-flops in the back seat, indicating she'd changed into proper footwear before starting her hike. Rob shouldered his 60-pound search pack and activated his GPS tracking system. The Devil's Backbone Trail stretched 8 miles through some of the most remote wilderness in the Cascades, eventually terminating at the ruins of what locals called the Covenant Church, an abandoned religious compound from the 1940s, where some kind of tragedy had occurred decades ago. The first mile of trail proved uneventful. Rob moved at a steady pace, his trained eyes scanning for any sign of Stephanie's passage. Broken branches, disturbed soil, fabric caught on thorns, anything that might indicate her route. The fog began to lift as he gained elevation, revealing the dense canopy of old-growth forest that had stood here for centuries. Then he found her first footprint. The distinctive tread pattern of a Merrell hiking boot was pressed deep into the mud beside a small creek crossing. Rob knelt and examined it closely. Fresh, probably less than 18 hours old. The stride length suggested she'd been moving at a normal pace, not running or stumbling. No signs of distress. "Stephanie!" he called out, his voice echoing through the towering trees. "Stephanie Morris, Forest Service, can you hear me?" Only silence answered back, heavy and oppressive. If this story is giving you chills, hit that follow button for more supernatural horror. What would you do in Robert's situation? Comment below. Rob continued following the faint trail of boot prints and disturbed vegetation. Stephanie had been a smart hiker, staying on the marked path and leaving clear sign of her passage. But as the morning progressed and the trail climbed higher into the mountains, something began to feel wrong. The forest was too quiet. In 12 years of wilderness work, Rob had learned to read the subtle languages of nature. Birds should be singing. Squirrels should be chattering in the branches. Insects should be buzzing. Instead, an unnatural stillness hung over everything like a suffocating blanket. Even the wind had stopped. Rob shook off the creeping unease, attributing it to the psychology of search and rescue operations. Stress and adrenaline could play tricks on the mind, making normal situations feel ominous. He was a man of science, not superstition. There were logical explanations for everything. His radio crackled. "Base to Ranger Mitchell. What's your status?" 3 miles in on Devil's Backbone, Rob replied, never breaking stride. Following clear sign. Subject appears to have been hiking normally. No indication of distress or deviation from trail. Copy that. Weather Service is calling for fog and possible thunderstorms this afternoon. You might want to... The transmission cut out in a burst of static. Rob frowned and checked his radio settings. Full battery, correct channel, antenna properly extended. He tried again. Base, this is Mitchell. Do you copy? Nothing but static. Technology failures weren't uncommon in the deep woods, especially with the region's unusual mineral deposits that could interfere with electronic equipment. Rob made a mental note of his position on the GPS and continued tracking. Mile 4 brought him to a small clearing where Stephanie had obviously stopped to rest. He found the impression of her body in the grass beside a fallen log, along with granola bar wrapper and an empty water bottle. She'd been taking care of herself, staying hydrated and maintaining energy levels. But something else caught his attention. Carved deep into the bark of a massive cedar tree were symbols Rob didn't recognize. Crude marks that looked almost like letters, but in no alphabet he'd ever seen. The cuts were old, weathered by decades of rain and snow, but still clearly visible. Rob dismissed them as the work of bored campers or teenage vandals. Every forest had its share of idiots who thought defacing nature was somehow meaningful. As he climbed higher, the temperature began to drop noticeably. What had started as a crisp autumn morning was becoming genuinely cold. Rob's breath began to mist, and he zipped his ranger jacket up to his throat. The GPS showed he was still 2 miles from the Covenant Church ruins, but already he could feel the oppressive weight of the place pressing down on him. The trail began to narrow and become less distinct. Stephanie's boot prints were harder to find among the fallen leaves and rocky terrain. But Rob's experienced tracker instincts kept him on course, following broken twigs and displaced stones that marked her passage. Then he saw the first building. What remained of the Covenant Church compound emerged from the fog like a fever dream made manifest in rotting wood and crumbling stone. A dozen structures scattered across a small valley, most partially collapsed after decades of neglect. The main church building still stood, its white paint peeling and its windows dark as empty eye sockets. Rob had been to these ruins once before, during his first year as a ranger. Even then, he'd felt an inexplicable sense of wrongness about the place. Not supernatural bullshit, just the natural human reaction to abandoned places where tragedy had occurred. According to local historical records, the Covenant Church had been a fundamentalist religious commune established in the 1940s by a charismatic preacher named Ezekiel Thorne. The sect had practiced increasingly extreme forms of worship, including ritual flagellation and speaking in tongues. In 1952, the entire community, over 60 people including children, had died in what authorities ruled a mass suicide. Poisoned communion wine, administered by Thorne himself before he put a shotgun under his own chin. Nasty history, but nothing supernatural about it. Just human madness and religious fanaticism taken to their logical extreme. Rob's GPS showed Stephanie's last known coordinates, placing her somewhere within the compound. He activated his emergency whistle, blowing 3 sharp blasts that echoed off the abandoned buildings like dying screams. "Stephanie, Forest Service, can you hear me?" His voice seemed to be absorbed by the fog rather than carried by it. Even his own breathing sounded muffled and strange. Rob approached the main church building methodically, his ranger training overriding the primitive anxiety clawing at the back of his brain. The massive wooden doors hung slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. But in the muddy ground in front of the entrance, he found what he was looking for. Stephanie's boot prints, clear and unmistakable, leading directly into the church. Rob pushed through the heavy doors and was immediately struck by the smell. Not the expected mustiness of an abandoned building, but something worse. Something organic and rotten, like meat left too long in the sun. He pulled out his heavy-duty flashlight and swept the beam across the interior. The church had been stripped of most furnishings decades ago, but the basic structure remained intact. Rows of broken pews faced a raised altar area, where a massive wooden cross still hung, tilted at an unnatural angle. The walls were covered with what looked like graffiti, but as Rob moved closer, he realized the markings were the same strange symbols he'd seen carved in the tree. And there, in the dust on the altar, was Stephanie's red hiking jacket. but no Stephanie. Rob keyed his radio, hoping the building's elevation might improve reception. "Base, this is Mitchell. I found evidence at the Covenant Church ruins. Subject's jacket recovered, but no sign of the hiker herself. Requesting immediate backup and possible canine support." Static was his only answer. As Rob examined Stephanie's jacket, looking for any clues about where she might have gone, he became aware of a sound. Barely audible at first, like wind through broken glass. But as he held his breath and listened more carefully, it resolved into something that made his blood run cold. Whispers. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, all speaking at once in hushed, urgent tones. The words were unintelligible, but the emotional content was unmistakable. Pleading, begging, crying. Rob spun around, shining his flashlight into every corner of the church, but found nothing. No source for the voices. No explanation for what he was hearing. Acoustic phenomenon, he muttered to himself, his scientific mind grasping for rational explanations. Wind through broken windows. Old building settling. Nothing more. But as he spoke, the whispers seemed to respond, growing louder and more urgent, and beneath them, another sound began to emerge. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere deeper within the building. Rob drew his service pistol, standard procedure when investigating abandoned structures, and followed the sound toward what appeared to be a basement entrance hidden behind the altar. The wooden steps creaked ominously under his weight as he descended into the darkness below. The basement was larger than the church above, extending far beyond what should have been physically possible. Rob's flashlight beam seemed to be swallowed by the darkness after just a few yards, as if the shadows themselves were somehow thicker here. And in that darkness, he found them. Dozens of wooden chairs arranged in perfect concentric circles around a stone table. On the table lay a leather-bound book, its pages yellow with age, and beside it a silver chalice that gleamed with unnatural brightness in Rob's flashlight beam. The whispers were deafening now, coming from all directions at once, and in their midst a new voice, clear and distinct and terrifyingly familiar. "Help me." It was Stephanie. Rob spun toward the sound, his flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. In the far corner of the basement, barely visible in the shadows, he could make out a figure sitting in one of the chairs. "Stephanie? Stephanie Morris?" The figure didn't respond, didn't move. Rob approached cautiously, his gun drawn and his heart hammering against his ribs. As his light fell across her, he saw that it was indeed the missing hiker, still alive, still breathing, but completely motionless. Her eyes were open but vacant, staring at nothing. "Stephanie, can you hear me? I'm a forest ranger. Your family sent me to find you." No response. Rob reached out to check her pulse, and the moment his fingers touched her skin, the whispers stopped. All sound stopped. The silence was so complete it felt like being buried alive. Rob couldn't even hear his own breathing, couldn't hear his heart beating. He tried to speak, but no sound emerged from his throat. Then Stephanie's head began to turn toward him with mechanical precision. Her vacant eyes focused on his face, and when she spoke, her voice came from everywhere at once. "You shouldn't have come here, Robert Mitchell. This is holy ground. Sacred ground. Blood ground." Rob stumbled backward, his scientific worldview crumbling like the rotting timber of the church above. Stephanie shouldn't know his name. He hadn't introduced himself. There was no rational explanation for what was happening. "The faithful await," Stephanie continued in that horrible, omnipresent voice. "Ezekiel calls to them still. They hear his word. They obey his command. Join us, Robert. Take your place in the eternal congregation." Rob's hand found his radio, and by some miracle it crackled to life with perfect clarity. "All units, this is emergency dispatch. Be advised, we have multiple missing persons in the Devil's Backbone area. 7 hikers have failed to return home in the past 48 hours. All were last seen heading toward the old Covenant Church ruins. 7 missing hikers, not just Stephanie." Rob looked around the basement with new eyes and realized the truth that his rational mind had been rejecting. The chairs weren't empty. In each one sat a motionless figure, their faces slack and their eyes vacant. 7 people, just as the dispatcher had said, all sitting perfectly still, all staring at nothing, all alive, but not living. "The congregation grows," Stephanie said, rising from her chair with unnatural grace. "Ezekiel's word spreads, his poison purifies. Join us willingly, Robert Mitchell, or be brought to the fold by force." The other figures began to rise as well, moving in perfect synchronization. Their footsteps echoed in the impossible vastness of the basement as they closed in around him. Rob did the only thing a rational man could do when faced with the utterly irrational. He ran. Up the creaking basement stairs, through the abandoned church, past the tilted cross and the whispering shadows. His boots pounded against the rotting floorboards as inhuman voices called his name from every direction. The fog outside seemed to pulse with malevolent life, reaching for him with tendrils of gray mist. But Rob Mitchell was a forest ranger. He knew these woods better than the things that haunted them. And as he burst through the church doors into the cold October air, one thought burned bright in his scientific mind. Some places are meant to stay abandoned. Some doors are meant to stay closed. And some congregations are never meant to find new members. Behind him, 7 voices spoke in perfect unison. "He'll be back. They always come back. The faithful always return to Ezekiel's embrace." Rob ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out. When he finally reached his truck at the trailhead, the sun was setting, though his watch insisted it was still morning. His radio crackled to life with crystal clarity. "Base to Ranger Mitchell, status report." Rob stared back toward the Devil's Backbone Trail, where fog was already beginning to gather among the trees like reaching fingers. "This is Mitchell," he said, his voice hoarse from screaming. "Mission unsuccessful. Recommend the Devil's Backbone Trail be permanently closed to public access." There was a long pause. Then Sarah's voice, confused. "Rob, what are you talking about? You left 15 minutes ago. You haven't even reached the trailhead yet." Rob looked at his watch. 7:02 a.m. But the sun was setting. The day was ending. He'd been gone for hours. Or had he? In his jacket pocket, something crinkled. Rob reached in and pulled out a yellowed piece of paper covered in the same strange symbols he'd seen carved in the trees. At the bottom, in careful handwriting, were 7 names. The faithful of Ezekiel's eternal congregation: Stephanie Morris, David Chen Maria Santos, Jacob Wheeler, Amy Foster, Robert Mitchell, blank line waiting. Rob crumpled the paper and threw it into the fog. But as he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the forest behind him, 7 voices were whispering his name, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that he would be back. They always come back. Holy shit, that was intense. Did that ending blow your mind? Like if you want more terrifying forest ranger stories, follow for daily supernatural horror. And comment your theory about what really happened to Stephanie. I read every single one. The end. Or is it? The radio crackled to life at 6:47 a.m., jerking Ranger Thomas Mitchell from his first sip of black coffee. The familiar weight of his duty belt felt heavier this morning as dispatcher Jenny's voice cut through the static. "Base to Unit 12, we've got a missing hiker. 23-year-old female Emily Patterson, last seen yesterday evening near Dos Wallops Trail. Family's frantic, Tom." Thomas keyed his radio, already reaching for his Garmin GPS unit. "Unit 12 copy. Any last known location?" "Negative. Her boyfriend says she was heading toward the old burned church area. You know the one." Thomas paused, coffee mug halfway to his lips. Everyone in Olympic National Forest knew about the Lutheran church ruins, what locals called Ember Church. Burned down in '87 under suspicious circumstances. Nothing more than foundation stones and charred timber now, but hikers still got lost in that sector regularly. The terrain was tricky, full of ravines and deadfall. "Copy that, base. Deploying now." Thomas clipped the radio to his belt and grabbed his search pack. 42 years old, 18 years as a ranger, and he'd conducted maybe 200 search operations. Missing hikers were usually just disoriented, dehydrated, maybe injured. Nothing his training couldn't handle. He texted Linda quickly. Missing hiker call, home by dinner. Love you and Sophie. His wife's response came immediately. Be safe. Sophie made you a drawing for your desk. The morning air bit at his cheeks as Thomas climbed into his Forest Service truck. October in the Pacific Northwest meant unpredictable weather, and the radio was calling for a storm system moving in from the coast. He had maybe 6 hours of good daylight. The drive to Dos Wallops trailhead took 37 minutes through winding mountain roads. Thomas knew every switchback, every mile marker. This forest was logical, predictable. Weather patterns, animal behavior, even human psychology. It all followed rules he understood. The trailhead parking lot held 3 vehicles: a newer Subaru Outback with California plates, an old Chevy pickup, and a Honda Civic that looked like it belonged to Emily. Thomas ran the license plate through dispatch and got confirmation. The girl's car had been there overnight. Base, this is Unit 12, located victim's vehicle at Dos Wallops trailhead, beginning foot search toward the church ruins. Thomas shouldered his 60-pound search pack, checking his gear systematically. First aid kit, emergency shelter, rope, flares, water purification tablets, energy bars. His Garmin showed 3.7 miles to the church site through old-growth forest. The trail was well maintained for the first 2 miles, then became increasingly primitive. The forest felt wrong immediately. Thomas tried to shake the thought. After 18 years, he'd learned to trust his instincts, but this felt different. The usual morning bird chorus was absent. No Steller's jays, no woodpeckers. Even the ever-present ravens were silent. Just his boots on the pine needle-covered trail and the distant hum of wind in the canopy. At the 1-mile marker, he found Emily's first breadcrumb, a granola bar wrapper wedged between 2 Douglas fir roots. Thomas photographed it with his phone and marked the GPS coordinates. Standard protocol. The wrapper was recent, probably yesterday evening based on the dew accumulation. She was definitely heading toward the church. He radioed back to base. The trail began its steep ascent toward the ridgeline where the old church sat. Thomas's breathing grew labored, visible puffs of vapor in the cold air. His radio crackled with updates from other units conducting parallel searches, but the reception was getting sketchy as he gained elevation. At mile 2, the maintained trail ended. From here, Emily would have been following an old logging road that hadn't been used since the 1970s. The path was overgrown with salmonberry bushes and devil's club, their thorns catching on Thomas's uniform pants. That's when he smelled it. Wood smoke. Old, acrid like a campfire that had been extinguished with water and left to smolder. Thomas stopped walking and inhaled deeply. Definitely smoke, but there shouldn't be any fire sources up here. Campfires were prohibited in this sector due to dry conditions, and the church had burned 31 years ago. Probably someone's illegal campsite, he muttered to himself. Idiots don't realize how fast fire spreads in these conditions. But the smell was wrong somehow. Too old, too cold. Like smoke that had been trapped in fabric for decades. Thomas found Emily's second breadcrumb at mile 2.8. A torn piece of blue flannel shirt caught on a low branch. Fresh blood dotted the fabric, not much. Probably just a scratch from pushing through undergrowth. But Thomas's pulse quickened anyway. Blood meant potential injury, and injured hikers made poor decisions. The GPS showed he was only 0.9 miles from the church ruins now, but the terrain was getting nasty. Steep ravines cut across the old logging road filled with fallen trees and standing water. Thomas had to detour around several washouts, following game trails that meandered unpredictably through the underbrush. His radio died completely at mile 3.4. Thomas cursed and tried switching to the emergency channel. Nothing but static. The mountains played hell with radio signals, especially when weather was moving in. He'd seen this hundreds of times. Standard procedure was to continue the search and establish radio contact when he reached higher ground. But something about the silence felt intentional. The trees began changing as Thomas approached the church site. The healthy Douglas firs and western hemlocks gave way to twisted, stunted pines that looked diseased. Their bark was blackened and peeling. though there was no evidence of recent fire damage. Many of the trees were dead, not from beetles or drought, but as if something had just drained the life out of them. Thomas's hands were shaking as he checked his GPS. 0.3 miles to target. He told himself it was just the cold, but his core temperature felt normal. The shaking was something else. Some primitive part of his brain was screaming at him to turn around. "Get it together, Mitchell," he said aloud. His voice sounded flat and muffled, like the forest was swallowing the sound. Just a missing hiker, just another search. But his training was screaming that nothing about this felt normal. The first stone foundation appeared through the trees like broken teeth. The Lutheran church had been built in 1923 by Norwegian immigrants, a simple structure that served the scattered logging communities. Thomas had read the historical reports. In September 1987, the building had burned to the ground during what investigators concluded was an accidental electrical fire. But locals whispered different stories: cult activity, ritual sacrifice, strange lights seen dancing in the windows weeks before the blaze. Thomas had always dismissed the stories as rural folklore. People invented mysteries to explain mundane tragedies. But standing at the edge of the ruins, he felt the wrongness settle into his bones like ice water. The foundation stones were arranged in a perfect rectangle, about 30 feet by 60 feet. Charred wooden posts still jutted from the ground at regular intervals, the remnants of the church's support structure. But something was wrong with the geometry. The angles didn't look right. The rectangular foundation seemed to twist and bend when Thomas wasn't looking directly at it. "Optical illusion," he said aloud, his breath forming clouds. Tired eyes, stress, elevation, nothing supernatural. But his voice sounded hollow even to himself. Thomas found Emily's third breadcrumb in the center of the foundation. A single hiking boot, size 7, still laced. No blood, no signs of struggle. It was sitting upright on one of the charred wooden posts as if someone had carefully placed it there. That's when Thomas felt eyes watching him. The sensation was so strong it made his skin crawl. He spun around, scanning the tree line, his hand instinctively moving to the pepper spray on his belt. Nothing. Just dead trees and the oppressive silence. But the feeling persisted. Multiple sets of eyes, watching from different angles. Intelligent, patient, hungry. Thomas photographed the boot and marked the GPS coordinates, trying to maintain professional procedure even as his hands shook. Standard missing person search. Document everything. Stay logical. There had to be a rational explanation for why Emily would remove one boot and leave it displayed like an offering. Hypothermia could cause confusion. So could head injury. Maybe she'd fallen, gotten disoriented, started removing clothing. Thomas had seen it before in severe exposure cases. But the boot wasn't just abandoned, it was arranged. Thomas circled the foundation perimeter looking for additional signs. The forest floor inside the ruins was different from the surrounding area, darker, almost black, as if the soil itself had been burned. Nothing grew here. No grass, no weeds, no moss on the stones. Just bare, sterile earth that crunched under his boots like charcoal. That's when he found the stairs. They descended from the north corner of the foundation, leading down into what must have been the church's basement. The wooden steps looked far too preserved for something exposed to 31 years of Pacific Northwest weather. They were dark, almost black but not rotted. Each step was worn smooth as if countless feet had passed over them recently. Thomas played his flashlight beam down the stairway. The light seemed to get swallowed after about 10 feet, revealing nothing but impenetrable darkness below. "Emily," he called down. "Emily Patterson, Forest Service. If you're down there, call out." His voice echoed strangely, bouncing off unseen walls with an acoustic that didn't match a simple basement. The echo lasted too long, and returned sounding different. Not quite his voice anymore. Thomas's training said to call for backup before entering any confined space. But his radio was dead and Emily might be injured down there. A basement would provide shelter from the weather. Maybe she'd taken refuge and gotten trapped. He descended the first step. It creaked but held his weight. The second step. The flashlight beams seemed dimmer now, the batteries draining faster than they should. Third step, the temperature dropped noticeably. Thomas could see his breath, though it had been relatively warm at ground level. Fourth step, something moved in the darkness below. Not Emily. Something bigger. Something that didn't move like a human. Thomas froze, every instinct screaming. This was wrong. The church basement should have been filled with rubble and debris after 31 years. There shouldn't be open space down there. There definitely shouldn't be something moving around. "Emily?" he called again, but his voice came out as a whisper. The movement stopped. Then, from the darkness below, Thomas heard breathing, deep, measured, patient, waiting. Not Emily's breathing. Something else. Thomas backed up the stairs slowly, his flashlight beam dancing wildly as his hands shook. At the top, he nearly ran from the foundation, his rational mind finally overridden by pure survival instinct. But he stopped at the tree line and forced himself to think like a ranger. Missing person search. Emily might still be down there. Maybe injured. Maybe unconscious. Maybe that breathing was just an animal that had taken shelter. A bear or even another lost hiker. Thomas keyed his radio desperately. Still dead static. He tried his cell phone. No signal. But that was normal this far from civilization. The smart thing would be to hike back to the trailhead and call for backup. But that was a 7-mile round trip, and Emily might not have 7 more hours. The weather was deteriorating, and if she was injured in that basement, Thomas made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He went back down the stairs. This time he descended all the way to the bottom. The basement opened into a space that defied physics. Thomas's flashlight revealed a circular chamber easily 50 feet across, far larger than the church foundation above. The walls were carved stone, covered with symbols that looked burned into the rock. Not graffiti. Something much older. And the chamber wasn't empty. 13 wooden chairs arranged in a perfect circle, each chair occupied by a figure in dark clothing, heads bowed as if in prayer. None of them moved when Thomas's light hit them. "Hello?" Thomas called. "Forest Service. I'm looking for a missing hiker." No response. The figures remained motionless. Thomas approached the nearest chair. The occupant was wearing a simple black dress, old-fashioned in style. Her hair was gray, pulled back in a severe bun. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was breathing. Slow, steady, peaceful. "Ma'am?" Thomas reached out to touch her shoulder. The moment his fingers made contact, she raised her head. Thomas stumbled backward, his light dancing wildly. The woman's face was normal, elderly, weathered, kind. But her eyes were looking at something behind Thomas, something he couldn't see. "The 13th chair," she said in a voice like autumn leaves. "We've been waiting." Thomas spun around. Behind him, at the center of the circle, sat an ornate wooden chair that hadn't been there moments before. High-backed, carved with the same symbols that covered the walls. Emily Patterson sat in the chair, hands folded, head bowed in the same position as the others. She was breathing, she was alive, but something was wrong with the rhythm of it. "Emily?" Thomas rushed toward her. "Emily, I'm here to take you home." She raised her head as he approached. Her eyes were Emily's eyes, young, brown, intelligent. But they were looking through Thomas as if he didn't exist. "The circle must be complete," Emily said in a voice that wasn't quite hers anymore. 13 chairs, 13 souls. The debt must be paid. "Emily, you're in shock. You're hypothermic. I'm going to get you out of here." Thomas reached for her arm. The moment he touched her, the other 12 figures stood in perfect unison. They turned to face Thomas with synchronized precision, their eyes all focused on the same invisible point behind his head. "The debt," they said in unison. "The debt must be paid." Thomas's flashlight died. Not dimmed, died completely, as if someone had cut the power. But the chamber wasn't dark. A soft, warm light emanated from the walls themselves, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. "In 1987, Emily said in that voice that wasn't hers, 13 people died in the fire. Not from accident, from sacrifice. They gave their lives to keep something contained. But the boundary is weakening. The circle is breaking. We need a replacement. You're not Emily, Thomas whispered. I am Emily, but I am also more now. I understand the debt, the responsibility. The forest needs guardians, Thomas. It needs people who will pay the price to keep the darkness contained. Thomas backed toward the stairs, but they were gone. The wall behind him was solid stone, covered with those burning symbols. Your family loves you, Emily continued. Linda makes you coffee every morning at 6:30. Sophie drew you a picture of a rainbow yesterday. They need you to come home. How do you know that? Because the forest knows everything that happens in its boundaries. Every word spoken, every thought shared, every love declared. The forest remembers. And the forest needs you to remember why you became a ranger. To protect people. To serve something larger than yourself. The 13 figures began moving closer, forming a tighter circle around Thomas. Their faces were kind, understanding, patient, not threatening, welcoming. One life, Emily said softly. One life given willingly to protect thousands. The fire in 1987 wasn't random, Thomas. Something was trying to break free. Something that would have killed everything for miles. 13 people chose to die to keep it contained. But they're tired now. 31 years of holding the boundary. They need relief. This isn't real, Thomas said. Hallucination from hypothermia. Oxygen deprivation. Psychological breakdown from stress. But even as he said it, he could feel the truth settling into his bones. The forest did feel different around the church. Always had. Other rangers avoided this sector when possible. Search and rescue calls here always had unusual complications. Equipment failures. Radio dead zones. People acting strangely after exposure to the area. The choice is yours, Emily said. But if you leave, if you walk away, the boundary fails within a year. And when it fails, images flooded Thomas's mind. Not thoughts, memories that weren't his own. The thing trapped beneath the church, ancient, hungry, patient, feeding on life force, growing stronger year by year. The 13 guardians holding it back through sheer will and sacrifice. If they failed, the entity would consume every living thing in the forest within days, then spread beyond, towns, cities. An ecological catastrophe that would look like a natural disaster, but hide something far worse. Linda and Sophie, Thomas whispered, would be among the first to die when the boundary fails. The entity feeds on love, on connection. Families are its preferred prey. Thomas felt tears freezing on his cheeks. The rational part of his mind was still screaming that this was impossible, supernatural, against everything he believed about the natural world. But the forest ranger part of his mind, the part trained to read signs, to understand ecosystems, to recognize when something was wrong, knew Emily was telling the truth. How do I know you're not lying? How do I know this entity even exists? Emily smiled sadly. Because you can feel it, Thomas. You've always been able to feel it. Why do you think you became a ranger? Why do you think you were drawn to protect the forest? The entity calls to sensitives, tries to lure them in. But people like you resist. You serve as guardians instead of prey. Thomas closed his eyes and extended his senses the way he'd been trained to do when tracking. Listening for the forest's heartbeat, feeling for the natural rhythms that indicated health or sickness. There, beneath the normal sounds, he felt it. A presence vast and hungry, pressing against some invisible barrier, held back by tremendous effort from 13 souls who had been standing guard for 31 years. The choice, Emily repeated. Stay and take your place in the circle. Protect everyone you love and everyone you've sworn to serve. Or leave and watch them all die when the boundary fails. Thomas opened his eyes and looked at the 13 figures. Up close, he could see they weren't quite human anymore. Still themselves, but changed. Stronger. part of something larger and more important than individual existence. Will it hurt? No, Emily said gently. It feels like coming home. Thomas thought of Linda's coffee and Sophie's drawings and 18 years of protecting people in these mountains. He thought of his oath as a ranger, his responsibility to serve others before himself. He thought of the entity pressing against the weakening barrier, and what would happen to his family if it broke free. Thomas walked to the 14th chair that materialized in the circle and sat down. "Thank you," Emily said as the transformation began. "The forest will remember your sacrifice. The people you save will never know your name, but they'll live because of your choice." The last thing Thomas felt as a fully human consciousness was gratitude. Not regret, not fear. Gratitude that he'd been given the opportunity to serve something larger than himself, to protect the people he loved and the forest he'd devoted his life to. Epilogue. Ranger Sarah Chen found Thomas Mitchell's truck at the Doe's Wallops trailhead 3 days later. His search pack was in the cab, his radio on the seat. No sign of the missing ranger and still no sign of Emily Patterson. The official report listed both as lost in the wilderness, presumed dead due to exposure and disorientation. The search was called off after 2 weeks. Linda Mitchell received Thomas's life insurance payout and moved to California with Sophie. She never remarried, and she never stopped believing that Thomas died trying to save someone else. The church ruins were quietly added to the Forest Service's restricted access list. No official reason given, just geological instability and potential hazardous materials. Rangers avoided the sector when possible, but sometimes, on clear mornings when the light hit the forest just right, hikers reported seeing figures standing among the foundation stones. 13 figures in dark clothing, heads bowed, keeping watch, protecting the forest and everyone beyond it from something that must never be allowed to break free. The boundary holds, for now. If this story gave you chills, let me know what you'd do in Thomas's situation. Would you make the same choice? Comment below. Want more supernatural forest ranger horror? Follow for daily stories that will make you question what's really lurking in America's wilderness. The static crackled through Tony's radio as he adjusted his grip on the worn leather strap of his pack. 3 months on the job, and he still felt like he was playing dress-up in his forest green uniform. The autumn air bit at his exposed skin, carrying the scent of decomposing leaves and something else, something that made his stomach clench with unease. "Ranger Martinez, what's your 20? Came the voice of dispatch, tinny and distant. Tony fumbled with his radio, nearly dropping it as his gloved fingers struggled with the button. Mile marker 7 on the Whisper Creek Trail. Still no sign of the missing hiker. Rachel Thompson. 24 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes. Last seen wearing a red windbreaker that should have stood out like a flare against the October forest. Her parents had called that morning, voices cracking with desperation, saying their daughter had gone for what should have been a simple day hike yesterday and never came home. Tony had been assigned the search because he was eager and available. Forest Service speak for expendable rookie. The veteran rangers were handling the more technical rescues up on Devil's Peak. His breath misted in the cold air as he checked his GPS. The battery showed full, but the screen flickered occasionally, numbers jumping between coordinates that made no sense. He'd bought the damn thing with his first paycheck, top of the line, and now it was acting up when he needed it most. "Copy that, Martinez. Keep us posted every 30 minutes, dispatch responded, then added with what sounded like sympathy. "You're doing good work out there, son." The radio fell silent, leaving Tony alone with the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant sound of Whisper Creek burbling over stones. He'd been hiking this trail since dawn, calling Rachel's name until his voice was hoarse, following protocol to the letter. Search pattern, evidence markers, note-taking, all the stuff they'd drilled into him at the academy. But the forest felt wrong today. Different. Tony had grown up camping in these woods with his dad, knew them like his childhood bedroom. Today, the familiar felt foreign. The shadows fell at angles that didn't match the sun's position. The usual bird chatter was absent, replaced by an oppressive quiet that seemed to press against his eardrums. His phone buzzed against his chest pocket, and he pulled it out to see a text from his wife, Maria. "How's the search going, baby? Thinking of you. Sophia drew you a picture of a forest ranger superhero." The emoji looked strange on his basic smartphone screen, pixelated and somehow unsettling. Tony smiled despite himself, thinking of his 4-year-old daughter's gap-toothed grin. Sophia had been so proud when he'd gotten the job, telling everyone at her preschool that her daddy was going to save people in the forest. Still looking. "Tell Sophia daddy's being careful like she taught me. Love you both." He tucked the phone away and continued down the trail, his heavy boots crunching on fallen leaves that seemed too brittle, too loud in the unnatural silence. The familiar weight of his pack, water bottles, first aid kit, emergency blanket, flares, should have been comforting. Instead, each item felt inadequate against something he couldn't name. That's when he saw her. Rachel stood about 50 yards ahead, perfectly still beside a massive Douglas fir. Her red windbreaker was brilliant against the muted browns and golds of autumn, exactly as described in the missing person report. But something was wrong with the way she stood. Too straight, too motionless, like a department store mannequin. "Rachel!" Tony called, relief flooding through him. "Rachel Thompson!" She didn't respond, didn't even turn her head. Tony broke into a jog, his pack bouncing against his back, radio static increasing with each step. "Ma'am, are you okay? Your family's been looking for you." As he got closer, details emerged that made his stomach turn to ice. Rachel's blonde hair hung perfectly straight despite the wind that rustled the trees around her. Her red jacket showed no signs of wear, no dirt or tears despite spending a night in the wilderness. Most disturbing of all, she cast no shadow despite the afternoon sun streaming through the canopy above. "Rachel?" Tony's voice came out as a whisper. She turned then, slowly, mechanically, and Tony's training abandoned him entirely. Where Rachel's face should have been was something else. Features that shifted and blurred like smoke, eyes that were too dark and too deep, a smile that stretched wider than humanly possible. The thing wearing Rachel's windbreaker spoke in a voice like rustling leaves. "She's waiting for you deeper in. Come find her, Ranger boy." Tony stumbled backward, his hand instinctively reaching for his radio. The static was so loud now it sounded like screaming. "Base, this is Martinez, I need..." When he looked up, the trail ahead was empty. No red jacket, no impossible figure, just the eternal dance of shadows between the trees. But now he could hear it, faint but unmistakable. A woman's voice calling for help somewhere in the deep woods, where the old growth trees blocked out most of the sky and the trail markers grew sparse. "Help me! Please, someone help me!" Rachel's voice, but not the thing he'd just seen. The real Rachel, lost and scared and running out of time. Tony's hands shook as he checked his equipment. His compass spun wildly before settling on magnetic north, or what he hoped was magnetic north. The GPS screen showed his location as a pulsing dot surrounded by blank space, as if the forest around him simply didn't exist in any database. "I'm coming, Rachel," he whispered, then keyed his radio. "Base, this is Martinez. I think I've got something." Following sounds of distress off trail coordinates. He looked at his GPS again, cursed under his breath. "I'll radio my position every 15 minutes. But the radio only hissed static in response. The voice called again, fainter now, deeper in the woods where the maintenance trails gave way to game paths and deer tracks. Tony clicked on his heavy-duty flashlight. Even though it was only mid-afternoon, the canopy above had thickened to the point where twilight seemed to have arrived hours early. His beam cut through the gloom, illuminating ancient Douglas firs with trunks wide enough to hide a small car. Many of the trees bore old scars, lightning strikes, fire damage, deep gouges that looked almost like claw marks. The forest floor was carpeted with years of fallen needles that muffled his footsteps until he seemed to be walking through a cathedral of silence. "Help! Over here!" The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing between the massive tree trunks in a way that made direction impossible to determine. Tony spun in a slow circle, his flashlight beam sweeping the darkness, trying to triangulate the sound. That's when he saw the others. They stood between the trees like a silent congregation, translucent figures in outdated clothing. A hiker in 1970s gear, his face caved in on one side where he'd struck rock during a fall. A young woman in a 1960s dress, her throat bearing the distinctive marks of a bear attack. An elderly man in overalls, burns covering half his body from some long-ago forest fire. All of them watching Tony with eyes that held depths of sorrow and something else. Hunger. Oh, Jesus. Tony breathed, his flashlight beam passing through the figures without casting shadows. Oh, Jesus. Oh, Jesus. Oh, Jesus. The spectral congregation parted silently, creating a path deeper into the woods, toward an area Tony recognized from his training maps. The old growth section where 3 separate search and rescue operations had failed over the past 50 years. Where people went missing and were never found. Where the voices of the lost still called for help on quiet nights. According to the local legends, the veteran rangers whispered about but never officially acknowledged. Rachel's voice called again, more urgent now. Please, I can see your light. I'm trapped. Tony's training warred with his terror. Protocol said to call for backup, establish communication with base, mark his trail clearly. But Rachel was real, Rachel was alive, and these things were showing him the way to her. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Maria. Sophia's asking when Daddy's coming home. I told her forest ranger superheroes always come home safe. Love you. The heart emoji appeared as a strange symbol his phone couldn't quite render, like a drop of blood on the screen. Tony looked up at the silent audience of the dead, then down at his phone displaying his family's love, then ahead toward Rachel's fading cries for help. He thought of Sophia's drawing, her absolute faith that Daddy was a superhero who saved people. Maybe it was time to find out if she was right. He clicked off the safety on his bear spray, checked the emergency flare in his belt, and followed the path the spirits had made for him deeper into the heart of the haunted woods, where the trees grew so thick they blocked out the sky entirely, and time itself seemed to move differently. Behind him, his radio crackled one last time with dispatch trying to reach him, but the sound faded quickly, swallowed by the forest that had claimed so many others. The dead followed at a respectful distance, their translucent forms drifting between the trees like mist, watching to see if this young ranger would join their eternal vigil, or if he might finally be the one to break the pattern and bring the living home. Rachel's voice called once more, closer now but somehow different, carrying harmonics that no human throat should make. Almost there, Tony. Come find me. Come play with us forever. Tony's flashlight flickered once, twice, then blazed steady as he pressed deeper into darkness, following duty and love toward whatever waited for him in the place where the lost souls gather, and where forest rangers either become heroes or legends whispered around future campfires. The trees closed behind him like a door shutting, and the normal world fell away entirely. If this story is giving you chills, what would you do in Tony's situation? Would you follow the spirits or turn back? Comment below. To be continued. Holy shit, that was intense. Did that ending blow your mind? Like if you want more terrifying forest ranger stories, follow for daily supernatural horror. And comment your theory about what's really happening to Rachel and Tony. I read every single one.